All right, one more uh, theory-based bit before we dive back into some mathier things. So in this section, we're going to talk about ethics in research. So why do we talk about ethics in a statistics class? Once you have statistical skills, there is a chance that you may end up doing statistical jobs, which means that you're working with data. And once you get involved with working with data, it's your responsibility to make ethical choices when doing so, even if you're working within a larger structure. So if you're doing statistical work related to research, uh, one thing that's important to think about ethics wise is whether the benefits of whatever you're doing outweigh the risks of that research. That's something that's difficult to weigh, difficult to determine. That should never be just one person's decision because people have very, very different moral codes. Doing research ethically involves treating any living creature that is involved in that research fairly and respectfully. Again, that is gray area to some degree, especially with animal research, for example, because people have very different ideas of how much animals are aware of, and therefore very, very different ideas about the morals around involving them in research. But even with humans, people have very, very different ideas about how it's okay to treat other humans. Other things that are ethical considerations in research have to do with data safety. So we live in a very fast-moving, technologically advancing world, and that means that very often we have people who are experts in their research fields working with technology that they are maybe not as well versed in because it didn't exist when they started. And that can create difficulty. But even if you're brand new to research and grew up with whatever kind of technology is being used, you can still make mistakes. Um, and sometimes people might share data on purpose if they have sensitive data that someone would be interested in, but we would hope that would not be the case, right? Um, Other things that are ethically important, following best practices for doing all the parts of research. Um, that seems like it should be able to go without being said, but it can't. Um, and following best practices for research also means that if you're the one in charge of a research project, you teach the best practices to whoever's working with you and monitor that. And so then both you and those individuals working with you have a responsibility for doing things according to best practices, because otherwise your data are potentially no good, which means that all of that research, anything that goes into it, was a waste. And then this last one, being transparent, honest, and as unbiased as possible. Again, the goal of scientific research is to provide information, just clear information. But researchers are humans and they get tempted by things sometimes, like publishing pressure, or like trying to send a particular message that they're really interested in sending. And if that happens, they might use data and use research in a way that is not transparent, not straightforward, and dishonest or purposely biased. Or if they're just not following best practices, their own bias may sneak in there without them realizing it. So some of these overlap. So how do we try to make sure that our research that is done is ethical? There are a variety of guidelines that are involved in research regulation. So there are some international guidelines that were established, in particular after World War II, because of some of the horrific things that happened during that time period, research-wise. So there are international guidelines, especially for medical research, and particularly when it comes to humans in medical research. There are also federal policies and US laws that protect human research participants, and that's medical research or other research. And those are, potentially enforceable by law enforcement agencies, but are monitored by one of the bullet points lower down, institutional review boards typically. You also have the American Psychological Association, if you're doing social science research, they have an ethics code, and that is a broad ethics code that has to do with a lot of different things, but there's a section in there on research, and also this one includes guidelines on animal research. Um, and so IRBs, I mentioned that they would monitor some of the federal policy stuff. IRBs are basically groups of five or more individuals, and that has to include researchers, non-researchers. It has to include an expert or two in the specific field. It also has to include a community member. And these institutional review boards are basically responsible for going through all of your plans for research before you ever get near a participant. So if you're doing psychological research, you make your whole plan, you give your justification, you figure out exactly how you're going to do the research, where you're going to get your participants, whether they're going to be compensated in some way, what you're going to have them do, what you're going to tell them beforehand, what you might withhold and tell them not until afterwards so that the research doesn't get messed with, all this stuff, right? All of these plans. You have to write all that up very formally and submit it to one of these boards, and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And you don't get near a participant until they have said, yep, you are good to go. Okay, so the institutional review board process is something that if you're in the United States doing any research that has any federal funding, or you are at a college or university that gets any federal funding, you have to put research through those. And then the last thing on here, researchers and research communities. Researchers have a personal individual responsibility, sorry, in the way of my own writing here. Researchers have a personal responsibility to monitor their own ethical behavior, and also to call it out if another researcher they are working with is doing something unethical. That can be extremely awkward, but it's necessary because our research, if we get information out of unethical research, it limits what we can do with that information because it limits how good the information is. So even at just a usability level, we need to be thinking about this. And then also, if you want to err on the side of being a subjectively good human, probably ethics should come into the mix when you're doing research, especially with living creatures. So, why do we have these regulations? As I mentioned, there were terrible, terrible experiments that went on during World War II in the concentration camps. But that is not the only reason, and that's not the first experimentation. That's just one of the first times that there was kind of a worldwide push for regulations that resulted in something like this. Just within the US, there are plenty of examples of unethical studies that have either been funded by or sometimes been completely under control of the US government. So it's not just because of World War II, it's because across the board, people seem to have a hard time doing things in an ethical way unless there are guidelines. So some of the other examples on here. The second bullet point, the US government conducting the Tuskegee syphilis study. That was a study in which participants, and it was Black men in this study, so it was participants of color in an underserved area. And they had syphilis, which when the study started in, I believe it was 1932, didn't have a cure. There was a cure developed for it when antibiotics became a thing in the 40s. The government just continued this study, didn't tell people that there was a way to cure syphilis. All sorts of bad fallout from that. The study went on for another like 30 years after that. Okay, that's not acceptable, right? That takes away people's autonomy. The LSD studies referenced in that bullet point, those were also government conducted studies where uh, people were basically lured into safe houses by prostitutes and then dosed with LSD and then studied without their consent and without their knowledge. So there have been some things that have gone on at universities. The Milgram experiments, those were experiments basically uh, demonstrating how much damage people are willing to do to another human if they're being told to by an authority figure. And There are, significant qualms about how those experiments were conducted, in terms of the ethics of those and the impact on the people who were in the studies, as well as how useful the information was given the setup. And there were, in addition, the Stanford prison experiments, which those people were college students were basically either told you're a prisoner or you're a guard, and the guards were told control the prisoners at all costs, and then did some pretty horrible things to them, and weren't allowed to leave when they wanted to. So there was a lot there again where there wasn't necessarily respect for participants' autonomy or mental health in either government studies or academic studies. It also wasn't uncommon in the past for uh, researchers to use populations like orphans or prisoners, folks who didn't really have any choice in the matter, as their participants in a variety of studies, especially if those studies were going to do damage. So, for example, there was a study done on orphans looking at treatment of speech disorders, except for the kids didn't have speech disorders. They were looking at what happens when you either give a kid positive feedback or negative feedback. So, half the kids, whether or not they had a speech disorder, were assigned to a group where they did kind of a speech therapy thing, but they were just scolded constantly and they developed speech disorders. And those lasted, long term. So the research induced long term difficulties for them, all sorts of messy stuff. Those are extreme examples of unethical research, as is this last one, which is just researchers straight up making stuff up, or purposely misrepresenting their data or picking and choosing what data to present in order to get their points across. So those are extreme examples. But there are a million more smaller examples of doing research in unethical ways that these guidelines are important to avoid. So, for example, bribing or coercing people to participate in research. It's really important that we explain to people what they'll be doing, and then let them make a choice and get their consent to involve them in that research. And that doesn't always happen. People might be pressured. People might be given, offers of compensation that they would have a difficult time refusing. So, for example, if a researcher targeted a poor population and then offered very large amounts of money for participating in research, even if that research was going to cause discomfort or had a lot of risks, that's iffy territory. Um, Failing to thoroughly explain what participating entails, that's not allowed. It happens relatively often. Or failing to explain it in language that makes sense. Researchers often use very academic language, and it's important to explain what somebody's going to be doing in language that is understandable to a non-researcher. Uh, it's super important to protect data, protect private information. So any kind of, identifying information that people are providing as part of the study, medical information, anything that might have any stigma attached to it has to be extra protected. But also, just in general, we have to be careful as researchers about storing data carefully, and shutting down files properly when we're not using them and whatnot. Um, just neglect is an issue. So, like neglecting participant safety. If you're doing a study where participants have to do an exercise thing that's going to get their heart rate up, you better screen for heart conditions, right? It's your responsibility as a researcher to make sure that you're screening for anything that could be an issue, and then monitoring for any issues and providing free resources for any problems you cause. And if you aren't able to do that, you can't do the research. And then other final example on here is just using, I mentioned earlier that it's really important to use best practices, use the, not cut corners, not use practices that are going to bias data. It's really important to use those proper research practices the whole time and know what those are in whatever field you're working in. And people just get lazy about stuff or just don't follow good practices because it's easier or cheaper or faster to do stuff another way that's going to introduce bias. Okay, so next we are going to uh, talk about research guidelines, kind of the summary of what it is that we have to do when we are working mostly with human participants. So we'll start with animals and then we'll switch over and talk about participants or human participants the rest of the time. Current guidelines for animal research. It is allowed. It is not illegal. Some people have very strong feelings about the ethics of it. As a result, a lot of animal research labs at universities, for example, are in deep basements where you have to have some kind of special, key in order to get into them to avoid, people sneaking in there and letting all the animals loose. So I animal research is allowed, but sometimes disputed. Researchers are allowed to do research on animals that they wouldn't do on humans. So they're allowed to do things like isolate them or use like sensory deprivation, like with young animals, they might deprive them of vision, like keep their eyes closed longer than they naturally would be in order to study the effects of that on their developing visual systems. So there are things that are allowed on animals that are not allowed on humans. Researchers are allowed to cause animals pain and distress. You're allowed to cause humans pain and distress too if they opt into it when it comes to research. Animals, the issue here is they can't really opt into it. You are allowed to cause them distress and pain if it's necessary for the research. You are also allowed to kill them, but you are not allowed to do so in a manner that causes them any additional distress or pain. It has to be instantaneous and painless. So things that you have to also do if you're doing research on animals, yes, you can cause them distress, but other than what's necessary for the research, you have to provide them with appropriate and comfortable living conditions. And you also have to let people come in and make sure that you're doing that. You have to get your research cleared by one of these IACUCs. It's similar to an IRB, but specifically for animals. And you have to allow them to monitor the research that you're doing and inspect the animals' enclosures and things like that. There are also guidelines depending on type of animal, based on what we think about how kind of conscious they are of what's going on with them and how intelligent they are, things like that. So that is pretty much all we'll talk about on that. Human subjects, we've got a lot more to say. Um, so human subjects, one of the biggest things as far as ethical treatment of human participants goes is autonomy. We have to respect human participants' autonomy, which means their right to basically make their own decisions and be in charge of themselves. So, one part of that is making sure that we have participants' informed consent. Uh, in most studies, there will be a formal informed consent document. The only exceptions to that are if you're doing like a really, really low key, risk free survey study asking about super simple stuff that's not going to be triggering in any manner, or if you're doing like an observational study in a public place. Other than that, informed consent documents, it is. And in those documents, you explain to the participant more or less what the research is for, like why you're there doing it, what institution you're with, um, what they would be doing in the study. So you don't have to tell them exactly every piece of it, but you have to give them an idea. Will they be taking surveys? Will they be doing tasks? Are those computer tasks, physical tasks? What's going on there? Are they going to do anything that's going to like get their heart rate up? Any kind of physical stuff like that? Are there any risks associated? Are there, if it's a survey, are there any categories of questions that might be upsetting? Um, are they going to do some kind of stress test where they might feel like social stress? So you explain the risks that might be involved, benefits of the study. Usually, benefits of research aren't to the individuals participating in the research, they're to society. The main benefit that people might get is some kind of compensation. So maybe some small amount of money or some kind of gift, something like that. So you explain all of that and you explain it in language that is clear to the potential participant. That means that these informed consent documents have to pack a lot of information, a lot of very technical information in, but be written at like a sixth or seventh grade level because you don't want to assume that everybody's reading at a high school level or above because that's not the case in our population. So, a lot of information in this document. You have people read through it, you go through it with them, and then you allow them to decide whether they want to participate if they are an adult and capable of making that choice. Um, or I should say, deemed legally reliable to make that choice. if you have a participant who is a minor, who's a child, or a participant who has some kind of cognitive thing that prevents them, or a medical issue that prevents them from communicating or from being able to make choices for themselves in that manner, then you would get their assent if they can give it. So if you're working with a little kid, for example, you would still ask them if they want to participate, and they would have to say yes to be part of it. But then you would also ask their guardian to give consent for them to be in the study, and that's who would legally be giving consent for them to be in it. Um, Other things, we are allowed to lie to participants, but we're not allowed to lie to participants outside of approved lies. So we have to run our lies by the IRB. It is sometimes necessary to withhold information in particular, so lies of omission, in order to not bias the data that people are giving us as they're participating in our research. It also might be necessary to straight up lie, a lie of commission, um, because it's necessary for some task. So, for example, if someone is playing a computer game where it's a little simulation ball game, and they and two other people in the game are bouncing a ball back and forth, that's actually a common task that's used in social research to simulate social rejection. You tell the participants that there's other people controlling the other little humans in the next room. There aren't. It's just a simulation thingy, and it's just programmed into the one computer, and there's only one participant. But you lie to them and tell them that, and then they think they're being rejected by actual humans, which is more powerful than being rejected by an algorithm. Right? So we're allowed to lie to participants, but it's within reason. Most of it is lies of omission. Um, in order to respect autonomy, we must allow participants to opt out at any time. They're allowed to skip at any time. They're allowed to just exit the study at any time. We don't like that as researchers. It's better if we can keep our participants, but it is absolutely vital to the study in terms of respecting autonomy that participants can just tap out if they're uncomfortable, if they're overwhelmed, if they, for whatever reason, are just like, nope, I don't want to. And then the other thing that we do to show respect for participants' autonomy is we debrief participants after the study's complete. So we provide participants with information about, maybe not about their specific data, but about more about what the study was about, more about what the different tasks were for, things of that sort. And then also, if there are risks that we want to screen them for, debriefing also means kind of checking in about that, if there is any physical distress or psychological distress that we need to attend to as researchers and provide resources for. Okay, so respecting autonomy with human subjects is really important. So is respecting safety. We want to protect participants. We want to screen for existing conditions that might be relevant. Like I said, monitor impact. Um, Basically, the rule is don't make messes you can't clean up. When it comes to protecting data, it used to be that data were stored in physical form, and they were stored in locked drawers, in locked cabinets, in locked rooms, in locked buildings. And that was the layers of security, right? Now it's more about knowing the security settings on different types of files, storing things on secure servers, uh, making sure that digital data are properly de-identified, meaning well, typically most data are stored where there's like a participant ID, and then you would have the participant ID linked to the actual participant, like some concrete piece of identifying information in one file, and then maybe have a separate file with all of their data for the actual study, and then a separate file with their contact information, all only labeled with the ID number. So the idea is if somebody got a hold of one file, it wouldn't give them a bunch of other information about that person. So all of those things are important for protecting human subject safety, either physical safety, psychological safety, or digital safety, informational safety. Uh, the transparency and bias prevention piece when it comes to, and this is really back to any and all research, but it is important for human research. A lot of this is self-monitored. This is the piece where it's most important that researchers call it out if they see something unethical going on in a space that they're working in. But there are also some kind of systematic pushes to, gotta fix this slide. It's got double quotation marks. Sorry. Okay. So open science practices, those are systematic pushes to basically make science more transparent, to make research more transparent. So, um, one of the issues in research currently is that we get publication bias, which means that research is more likely to be published if you get significant results, if you find a connection between things that you're expecting to find. We don't always find what we're expecting to find, and it is actually absolutely vital to the scientific process that whatever questions we're asking, the answer could be no, it's not what we expect. Okay, that's part of science is finding the opposite of what you expect or nothing at all. But journals that publish scientific articles are more likely to publish ones that are exciting, which are the ones that have the significant findings. That's publication bias. That ends up misrepresenting what the field is finding as a whole. So, one open science practice is you pre-register your research questions. You basically send in to the journal that you're trying to publish in your introduction, your explanation of all the background related to your research, what your research question is, your hypotheses, what you expect to find, and what your design for the research is, how you'll be gathering data, all of that kind of thing, how you'll be analyzing it. You get that plan approved by them in the same way that you would get a plan approved by an IRB, and then that's them accepting that, yeah, they'll publish that when you're done, as long as you finish the write-up appropriately. So by doing that, even if you don't find what you expect, they're saying, yeah, we think this is good research, which means if the opposite of what you thought is found, that's actually important because that means it's going against what the field is expecting, and we need that information. Another thing that's an open science push is posting data and computer code so that other people can work with it, verify your calculations, make sure there were no mistakes made, poke around with it, see if you missed something. Um, there are sometimes issues with that. So, for example, in graduate school, I worked with a project that was a longitudinal project, meaning it went on for a long time. And we were still actively using data for years. And so, the folks in charge were not willing to publish the data or analyses because we were still using it. And they didn't want other people to be using the data that we were using. So, we can't always post data, or folks aren't always willing to post data. But once it is posted, it means that other people can verify and check for mistakes and whatnot. So it helps with the research community monitoring itself. And then the third bullet on here for open science practices is about making research more available to people in general. Right now, the places that you most often see academic research published is going to be in scientific journals. And as far as research for school, those and then some other or non-academic organizations, some government organizations or research hubs are the places that you would really look for dependable information. But if you're not a student or a professor or otherwise working with a college or university, then you might not have access to those unless you pay a lot of money because one article, not one journal, but one article can be 40 or 50 bucks easily in a lot of traditional journals. So one of the other things that's a big push, one, federally funded research under at least certain grants has to be made freely available after a certain amount of time. So it can be paywalled for a while, but then after that, it has to be made freely available. That's better than nothing. Um, there are also journals that, as the person trying to publish the research, you pay a fee and then that makes it available to everybody. That's great in terms of accessibility for people who would be reading those articles. But if you are not, if you're a graduate student with no money trying to publish an article, that means that you can't really do that unless somebody else funds you for it. So a whole bunch of stuff around publication, but the idea is the more research can be made freely available to people, the better, because science is supposed to be information that helps society at large, and so it should be available to society at large in its raw form. So that is where we will stop on ethics here. Again, the reason we talk about this a bit is if you go into anything research based, anything where you're doing a lot of stats, it is your responsibility to make sure that you know the best practices in the field that you're working in and follow those practices. So do that. Use your statistical skills for good.